Hey you! Yes, you, watching this video. Do you want to own a piece of Scribbler? Only not a lock of hair or blood or flesh or anything else that will get you in trouble with the law? Well, now you can, with t-shirts, hoodies, tote bags and mugs featuring Obab Scribbler at her Teespring store. You know you want to. I shall now stop talking in third person and send you on to the video. Be lovely to each other and enjoy the show!
Ponytails. Read by Scribbler.
Button Mash rose with a groan on unsteady hooves. He reached a hoof back and felt the goose egg already rising beneath his mane. He shook his head to clear his blurred vision and took in his surroundings. He was in a bedroom, plain and sparsely decorated. A spare Stetson on the bedpost gave the room's owner away. Any further analysis was pushed away by a noisy groaning coming from above. He looked up just in time to see the ceiling give way completely. He jumped back against the wall as debris and snow fell with a massive thud into the room. He coughed away the dust and shivered in the new cold that found its way into the house via the sizable hole in the roof.
And Applejack promised the ceiling wouldn't collapse.
He muttered through chattering teeth. The dust cleared completely and revealed a nightmare. The thud had not come from the debris, and the ceiling had not given way from the snow. The beast that now stared at Button Mash was huge, easily 8 feet tall, with another foot or two added from the enormous curved horns that emerged from beneath the hood of the creature's black cloak. The creature shifted its position on jet-black hooves that contrasted with the midnight blue of the beast's fur. A tangled white beard hung from its chin, blowing softly in the wind. It stared at Button with eyes that burned like red-hot coals and grinned with a mouthful of dagger-like fangs. Around the beast's neck hung a great golden bell that jingled softly with every move it made. Button Mash's mouth became dry as sand.
Grogar?
The beast's grin grew wider, and it tilted its head in acknowledgement. Button was no longer sure if his shaking was from the cold or from fear.
But I was good this year, wasn't I?
Grogar seemed to pause a moment in consideration, then nodded his head again.
So how about we trade that for a free pass tonight?
Again, Grogar seemed to consider, then shook his mighty head with a chuckle.
But that's not fair!
Grogar shrugged his huge shoulders and took a heavy step toward the cowering colt.
Hey, goat face!
Both Grogar and Button Mash looked at the room's doorway. Sweetie Belle squared herself and glared, her minute horn lit with the same emerald light that had saved her from impalement. She was done being scared, and was now furious that the same monster that had taken her best friend was now threatening the recipient of her first kiss. She reached out with her magic and seized the heaviest thing she could find.
Get your big blue tail away from my coat friend!
Applejack's bed, bathed in Sweetie Belle's magic, rose into the air and swung like a huge oblong golf club. It struck Grogar full on and knocked the ram right through the wall and into the howling storm. Button Mash stared in wonder. Sweetie Belle raced to his side and looked him over.
Are you okay?
Seeing his amazed stare, she grinned.
Yeah, I had no idea I could lift something that big. You called me your cult friend.
Her pride deflated like a balloon.
What? have a bear friend! Yes!
Bud and Mash whooped with joy before remembering where he was.
I might also freeze to death.
Sweetie Belle shook her head and grabbed his foreleg in hers.
Save it for later, Drake. We've got to get out of here.
Bud and Mash let his new mare friend pull him along with a bemused smile on his face.
Whatever you say, Scarlet Avenger.
Now, y'all keep calm and quiet.
Applejack lit another lantern and passed it to Diamond Tiara, who passed it along to Applebloom.
We'll wait here a while and... Wait. Where's Marble?
The roof of the barn suddenly came crashing in as an enormous form crashed into the room. The three ponies screamed as the huge ram landed on all four hooves and shook off whatever impact had sent it plummeting into the room. It quickly focused its attention on the ponies, Hood falling back as it turned its head sharply. Applebloom saw the horns and screamed again.
Grogar.
Applejack whispered in terrified wonder. She shook off her amazement and placed herself firmly in front of the fillies.
Not one more step, you overgrown goat!
Grogar narrowed his burning red eyes and drew from his cloak an enormous burlap sack. The top was wrapped in chains that coiled like snakes and were adorned in jingling bells. Whatever was in the sack was still moving. Applejack called on her last reserves of courage and returned the beast's glare.
You ain't gonna take these fillies! I'll die first!
Grogar grinned and nodded, as though she had just described his exact plan.
Applejack?
She looked back at her little sister, her last remaining family member, and remembered the promise she'd made to their dying mother.
I'll take care of this sugar cube.
Applebloom stared at her, frozen with fear. Applejack looked back at the beast.
You're not a mindless monster. You can make deals, right?
Grogar tilted his head curiously.
You've already taken 2 fillies, my brother, and my granny. That's a pretty good haul for you, I imagine.
Grogar crinkled his eyes and grinned. His teeth glistened in the lantern light.
If I make it a nice round 5 and I go willingly, will you leave these 2 alone?
Applebloom's paralysis broke, and she darted forward.
Applejack, no!
A quick-thinking Diamond Tiara snatched her tail in her mouth, holding fast. She stared at Applejack with complete shock that this mare would sacrifice herself for her. Grogar's grin faded, and he curled his lip in obvious distaste for the deal.
It'll work out for you in the end. These 2 will tell every pony what happened here tonight, and you'll be more feared than ever.
His grimace faded as he considered the bargain.
Applejack!
Applebloom screamed. She kicked wildly at Diamond Tiara's muzzle.
Let me go!
Applejack ignored her sister as best she could.
Well, have we got a deal?
Grogar's eyes narrowed, and he nodded. Applejack finally looked back at her sister and smiled, tears in her eyes.
I love you, sis. Be good.
Applebloom wailed as the chains unwrapped themselves from the bag and darted out. They wrapped around Applejack and locked securely in place. The sack fell onto its side and opened wide. Within, there was a great black void from which the only sounds that could be heard were wailing winds and screaming ponies. Applejack stood fast as the chains began to drag her toward the sack. Tears flowed down Diamond Tiara's face as she held tightly to Applebloom. As she stared at Applejack's approach to her fate, she noticed something amazing. Applejack was getting younger. Every inch the chains dragged her seemed to take the years away from the mare. Soon, she was a stocky teenager. Another few inches, and she was a filly on the cusp of marehood. At the threshold of the sack, she was a filly not much younger than the ones she had just given her life to protect. Even her cutie mark was gone. Grogar watched the scene with quiet amusement. and then he took a step toward Apple Bloom and Diamond Tiara. Applejack looked back with terrified eyes.
No!
It was a filly's cry, shockingly similar to Apple Bloom's own.
No! Grogar, no! We had a deal! We had a deal!
Grogar simply laughed and took another heavy step. Applejack began to struggle against the enchanted chains, her muscles, honed by farm work, no longer at her call. She felt her hoof touch the edge of the sack. She looked back at the void and felt her blood freeze. Standing just inside the bag were a colt and 2 fillies. The colt was red and unnaturally tall for his age. One of the fillies was slate grey, with a mane and tail that seemed to be as perfectly cut as stone. The other was the green of a young apple, and hair the colour of sunshine. They were all smiling at her and laughing. Tears ran from their eyeless sockets. Applejack felt the chains loosen and turned to flee, and watched as the sack drew itself closed, held tightly by the enchanted chains. Her last wail echoed through the barn. Apple Bloom screamed in agony and fell limp upon the floor of the barn. Diamond Tiara spit out her tail and sat heavily by her side. The huge ram took another step, chuckling loudly. The bell on his neck danced and sang with every horrible peal of laughter that came from his throat. Diamond Tiara lowered herself beside Apple Bloom, resigned to her fate.
I'm sorry.
The yellow filly muttered.
What?
I'm sorry I was such a crummy friend to you. I'm sorry that I held a grudge against you for so long.
Apple Bloom sobbed as she met Diamond Tiara's eyes. Diamond Tiara sniffled.
I'm sorry too. I'm sorry that I didn't tell you my problems sooner.
The fillies embraced, their tears running onto each other's coats.
You're a good pony, Tiara. I never told you that. And you're a good friend.
You saved me, Bloom. That's the best thing any pony's ever done for me.
Diamond Tiara felt her tiara fall and clatter to the floor.
You're the best friend any pony could ask for.
Grogar leaned toward the cowering fillies. The lanterns all died as one. And the barn was suddenly filled with blazing light. Grogar drew back with a surprised roar. He looked at the roof of the barn in confusion. The sun was not supposed to rise for hours yet, but the light was not coming from outside. Grogar looked back at his prey and found they were on fire. The 2 fillies were coated in a dancing violet flame that gave an unearthly light. The heat that came from that flame was comforting and strong, but not overwhelming. The light was the light of safety and security. Apple Bloom and Diamond Tiara were emitting the light of friendship's flame itself. Grogar roared in fury, determined not to be denied his prize. He reached out a hoof to grab the pair, and was touched by the flame. He cried out in shock and anger as his hoof caught fire. The flames spread across his entire being. He struggled against the fire's heat and light, tried to retreat into his comforting cold and darkness, but the flame would not be denied. Friendship decreed that Grogar had had his fill of misery this hearth's warming. The fire spread across the whole of Grogar's enormous frame. He bellowed in defiance, but it was far too late. The light and heat grew and grew, forcing Grogar's essence back to Tambalon for another year, the bells finally ceasing their infernal jingling. For an instant, The inside of the barn was brighter than the brightest daylight. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the light was gone. Grogar's final roar faded into silence. The howling winds petered out and died. Applebloom and Diamond Tiara pulled apart and stared at each other in wonder.
Did we?
Easily?
Wide grins broke out on their faces, and they embraced again, squealing with joy.
Oh my gosh! Oh, I'm so glad.
Hello?
They looked up to see Sweetie Belle and Button Mash standing in the barn's open doorway. Button Mash was staring at the ground beside the two fillies.
Is that what I think it is?
All eyes fell on the enormous golden bell that now rested on the ground. Engraved in ornate writing along the bell's rim was a single phrase repeated over and over again.
For goodness sake.
The four little ponies screamed as a small shape jumped in from the hole in the roof. It was a filly. Her fur was grey, and her mane was shining silver. She reached out a hoof and caressed the bell reverently. Diamond Tiara swallowed.
Sylvie!
Silver Spoon looked up sharply. Her mouth was frozen in a rictus grin. Her eye sockets were empty and staring, tears still running down her cheeks. Diamond Tiara reached behind her and carefully handed her best friend her glasses. Silver Spoon cocked her head in confusion at first, then seemed to freeze in sudden remembrance. She lifted the cracked frames to her face and adjusted them until they were perfectly centered. For a single instant, the old Silver Spoon was back. She smiled at Diamond Tiara.
Thank you. I'm so sorry.
Sylvie!
Diamond Tiara started, but the spell was broken. The grinning ghoul that Silver Spoon had become bent down, grasped the heavy bell in her mouth, and vanished out the hole in the roof and into the night beyond. The silence that followed seemed to stretch on forever.
Well,
Button Mash clapped his hooves together and looked around at the three fillies.
at the risk of not sounding cool in front of my new mare friend, I could really use my mommy right about now.
The blizzard had cleared completely by the time the sun began to rise. The four little ponies emerged from the barn at first light and started the trek back toward Ponyville. For the rest of the night, they'd comforted each other and did their best to get some sleep. Now it was time to find the others and tell them what had happened. Diamond Tiara pushed her tiara back into place and looked at Applebloom.
What's gonna happen to you now?
I don't know.
The filly shrugged as she walked.
Suppose they'll send me off to Manhattan to live with Babs until I get old enough to inherit the farm.
Diamond Tiara sniffed indignantly.
And have my new best friend leave for a few years? Nonsense. You can come live with me until the farm starts back up.
Applebloom gave the rich filly a small grin.
And I suppose you'll have no problem getting your mom and dad to agree to that?
Diamond Tiara rolled her eyes.
It's not like some pony didn't help me understand that my special talent is getting other ponies to do what I want or anything.
Behind them, Sweetie Belle was briefing Button Mash on what to do around Rarity.
Most importantly, do not tell her that we're together.
And why not?
Button pouted.
Are you embarrassed of me already?
Sweetie Belle pecked his cheek.
Of course not. But if she catches even an inkling of the fact that we're special sun ponies, she'll start fitting me for a wedding dress.
The two ran right into the tails of Applebloom and Diamond Tiara. The two fillies were standing frozen in the middle of the road.
I don't think Rarity's going to be a problem, Sweetie Belle.
Sweetie Belle and Button Mash pushed up until they could see what had spooked the other two. Button Mash fell face first into the snow in a dead faint. Sweetie Belle started screaming uncontrollably and raced ahead as fast as she could. Diamond Tiara sank back on her haunches and started to laugh uncontrollably, tears running down her cheeks as the sound became not that much unlike a high keening wail. Apple Bloom thought back on the night before.
It ain't about what you believe or how old you are anymore. He's here now, and he will not stop until he has claimed his all.
But let's be honest with ourselves here. We're not just here because Bloom asked us over. We're here so our parents will get rid of us for the night.
Discarded on Hearthwarming Eve.
We are all being punished for it.
Ponyville was ruined. Huge icicles peered upwards through the roofs of the houses. The buildings that were still standing were either frozen solid or packed so tightly with snow that it poured from the windows like waterfalls. An enormous snowdrift had buried the center of town, the town hall only visible by the uppermost part of its roof. There was no sign of any pony anywhere. They were all gone. With a sudden stirring of wings, Princess Celestia herself landed in the snow. She took in the devastated town with shock and horror. She looked down at Apple Bloom and touched her shoulder with a hoof.
My little ponies. What happened here? Where is every pony?
Apple Bloom looked up at her with sunken eyes, her once red mane now the same white as the snow. A single tear ran down her cheek.
Grogar came to town and punished them. He punished them all.
She grinned.
You better be good, Princess. You better be good. For goodness sake.
Without another word, she wrapped her foreleg around Diamond Tiara's shoulders and joined her in her screaming laughter. The sound of madness echoed in the emptiness of Ponyville. And just above that, just barely audible, was the ringing of a single bell.